And we are live. Hi, Siobhan. How you doing?
Good. Just came off of a good holiday. So,
Excellent. Okay, so we're here to talk about the recent data I released. Of course, I released a video yesterday on what I'm sort of calling for now the triglyceride carryover effect.
mhm.
Now, it's not, this is, it's funny because in a sense, this is not truly new news in regard to, we've recommended for a long time that people fast for at least 12 hours, water only fast for at least 12 hours. But what is probably new is that if you were to approach me a couple weeks ago and say, hey, Dave, I fasted for more like 10 hours and not 12 hours, I would have said, yeah, that's probably fine. Like, I
Yeah.
wouldn't have expected it would be like I wouldn't have been surprised if I found that it was a little higher, but I would assume that it wasn't really that relevant. And this most recent data, granted, we're going to get into how this is very context specific, but this most recent data that I've been showing and have replicated several times over several days has really altered my thinking on this. So let me kind of spell it out for those people who haven't seen the last video. I mean, basically the gist of it is that I found while being carnivore and while also having other confounders that I talked about in the video, which aren't massive confounders but may be a factor, I was finding that I would wake up my immediate lipid test that I would take with a cardio check when I woke up would show extraordinarily high triglycerides. When I say extraordinarily high, I don't even mean double what I normally have. And I don't mean just above 100. I mean, I could get above 200, or for that matter,
Right.
even like
And
at 150.
like if it was like 110, because that's happened to me before where a test came back at 110, I was just like, oh, whatever, that's not really. But if I saw like 2 or 300 on a lab test and they're like, well, I was 11 hours fasted or 10 hours fasted, that would be like, what?
Right.
That's a look further thing for me.
Yeah, it is. And for sure, that launched me into that very first test showing that was around 220, I believe. That launched me into a very serious investigation where I ended up getting an overnight order here. I'm right now visiting family away from my home in Las Vegas, and I had them overnight just a ton of CardioCheck strips and tubes, and went to work trying to find first of all if this was going to be repeated, and sure enough, it was. It happened again the following day, and the rest of which you can go ahead and see in the video. Now, the thing I didn't get into is my original core hypothesis, which still is pretty much my number one so far, is that when you look at my prior data compared to now, you'll see that I have already done waking triglyceride tests, or for that matter, just waking lipid tests overall. And my triglycerides were usually below 100. Now, there was a key exception to this one time that I caught in the resistance training experiment. That was the experiment where I kept all the food exactly the same all the way through the experiment. And then the only thing that I changed was I weightlifted and did HIIT and so forth 2 times. And the second of those 2 times for 3 days following, I had slightly higher triglycerides. I want to say it was like 130, right? But that was still very dramatic to me at that time. And again, because my diet was identical all the way throughout, it seemed to be that it was in response to possibly muscle repair, which led me to pontificate that, hey, maybe my body's upregulating lipolysis to activate more of the VLDLs in order to dump off their cargo and then have LDLP. I know it's getting a bit geeky for many of you out here, but basically to have the LDL particles be provided in a higher level to a higher degree for muscle growth and repair. Anyway.
Now, with this information, do you think that's still true, or is it similar
No.
to this? Not.
I think this is a different thing. And this is where I'm really happy with how I conduct experiments, because had I had other things going on in that last resistance training experiment, then I couldn't feel as confident as I do now. The reason I have this level of confidence from the last experiment was, again, kept everything so identical from one day to the next, except for the working out. Now, it's possible things that the working out did have some relation to what this is, but I
Yeah,
don't.
that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, I don't. So, for example, insulin response, glucose. Like, for example, for during the second intervention, obviously I brought up glucose in the blood, therefore could have had a significantly higher level of insulin, which may ultimately have a downstream result. But I would expect it would actually go the other direction and bring my triglycerides down relatively for the next several days, if anything. So anyway, this gets to my core suspect theory. My core suspect theory is that being on carnivore, I am truly probably at the lowest level of insulin necessity that I've ever been at, because my carbs are truly just like at the floor. I'm having mainly beef, and in having just mainly beef, I see this in my own numbers. My waking glucose numbers tend to be lower than what they were during my keto diet, and my beta hydroxybutyrate numbers tend to be higher. They're closer to anywhere from like 1.5 to 2.2, which is pretty high for me. It definitely suggests that there's just less overall insulin. I'll also have, by the way, labs that came in from last Wednesday morning, which will also include my insulin then, and I suspect that's going to be a lot lower. And because of this, because I'm operating at a lower level of insulin, I mean, setting aside basal and bolus, levels and so forth, just overall, my insulin overall being lower, I think it's possible that there's a longer residence time of possibly chylomicrons and VLDLs when it's elevated to getting to the point where it can actually be fully pulled down. Now, I know the literature is a little mixed on this. I'm not sure how familiar you are. And in some circles, they'll say, hey, insulin doesn't matter at all for uptake of triglycerides off of lipoproteins. And some they say, no, actually, it is relevant. You need still a little bit of insulin in order to have proper uptake and the whole process with beta oxidation and so forth, right?
Right. So for people who aren't aware, I've actually been carnivore for about 14 months now, so over a year. And I've never actually seen this in mine, but I may have actually like done a detriment to myself in how careful I am, because I was like, oh, okay, we recommend 12 to 14 hours fasting. I'll make sure every single time I'm at the 13-hour mark.
Exactly.
So I may have just skipped over it entirely. And there's also some additional differences. Up until recently, I was drinking diet soda. There's some speculation that can cause an insulin response in some people. I still drink coffee, don't drink the diet soda anymore. And I'm also typically not eating beef. Usually I'm eating pork or poultry still, unless I'm in Texas, and then I eat brisket.
So yes, that would be a distinction. And it would be, I mean, you're planning on getting a cardio check, is that right?
Yeah, as soon as I return back to the States, because like you, I am currently away from my home base.
Right. So when you do, I assume you'll want to do the same thing that I'm certainly doing, which is I'm now wanting to get my triglycerides right before I go to sleep, because that number is turning out to be extremely relevant to what the number is going to be on the morning following. In fact, in about 50 minutes, I'll be taking my my lipids again, and I predict it'll be below 100. I went to sleep last night with triglycerides up at around, I want to say it was around 180, I think. And then I woke up this morning with around 170. And I took a test a little while ago, but it basically was a total of 10 hours that had passed since I had that last meal, because I had the last meal very late last night. I was joining a family member and talking to them about some things. And so I was like, you know what, I'll actually turn this into an experiment, because it'll be a very short gap of time between when I eat and when I go to sleep.
Right.
But will that not make a difference in that I'll end up having a total 12-hour cycle coming back to when I test my blood, to where I'll find the triglycerides are back below 100, and I hypothesize it will. I believe that that's what's going to happen.
Do you think that the sleep is affecting this at all? So for example, if you had, say, breakfast instead of dinner as your last meal, and then you tested like 9, 10, 12 hours later, do you think that would make a difference even if there was no sleep in there?
I think it would. If I'm gonna take a wild guess, and certainly this would kind of back up the potential on the insulin side of the ledger, I'm gonna guess that the uptake slows when you're sleeping, just like it would with so many of the other operations associated with absorption, right? So it's a reason it's not a good idea to eat before you go to bed because of what's already, going through your GI tract. And engaging the parasympathetic and so forth. So that leads me to another theory that's been floated. I first heard it from Amelia, who's in one of our groups, and I believe it's one of the questions. Let's actually just jump to that question real quick. I think you had it posted. I'm going to go ahead and come to it because somebody else asked this in YouTube, and yeah, it's from Rad. He says, begs the question of rate of gastric emptying relative to macros. Protein isn't really fuel like fat, carbs, so I would hypothesize that it empties from the stomach slower to moderate absorption, which would then push back triglyceride levels temporarily. Now, I think that I have a little bit of anecdotal evidence that may back that theory up, which is that since being carnivore, I haven't observed this all the time, but I've observed it a few times that when I have a fairly heavy meal, I seem to have a little bit of that postprandial tiredness, a little bit more than I'm used to in keto. Again, a few times total that it's been to a degree that I would notice. Otherwise, it's not really been that noticeable. And I don't know if there's some other context to that. Again, I want to just mention I'm under like a little more stress than I normally am. Good stress for the most part. But that could be another factor. And so I don't know. It's hard to say for right now. But basically the net of it being, hey, what if total digestion and clearance, if you will, from my GI tract is being slowed down by the current diet that I'm on? Well, that would lend a lot more credibility to that possibility that the triglycerides would be staying higher for a longer period of time.
Right.
Should we go through some more of these questions?
Yeah. So Stephen asks, so dawn phenomenon, but for fat-based energy instead of glucose. So essentially, do you think this is related to the dawn phenomenon where people are seeing higher levels of glucose in the morning that start to trend down after a couple hours?
It's possible, but I'm actually very skeptical of that. As you learn with the dawn phenomenon, a lot of that is, you could say some degree of that is priming the pump, but a lot of it is inducing some operational push, if you will, that glucose can kind of do a little more uniquely. What we find more and more with fatty acids is there's sort of a very passive form of energy, whereas glucose is very much I don't know how much I want to say active, but it activates more of a hormonal response than fatty acids do. Like that, I could say very confidently. And so in that respect, I'm a little skeptical, but it's possible. And if I were to try to be the devil's advocate to myself, that may be what happened with the resistance training experiment, in that after the second intervention, my body might have responded to, hey, we actually may need more energy availability, and responded for a period of time, and thinking that might be the case. It's about as far as I could stretch that, I think.
Yeah. So D. Ath asked, was the carnivore diet keto or mainly protein-based? He said it seemed mostly meat-based compared to fat. And then he follows up with, have you done the same experiment with completely keto or standard American diet? So we could compare.
So to the first part, it's definitely much more protein heavy, in that even though I'm picking fatty pieces of meat, I'm landing at around, I want to say about 64% fat and 35% protein with about 1% carbs. So certainly higher protein, relatively speaking, even when I'm trying to eat a lot more fat. We'll see how it shakes out when I have kind of the eggs a bit more, but I think it's going to be not too much different. It's hard to get up to super high fatty levels without processed or refined forms of fat in some way, or some kind of packaged fat bomb, something along those lines. Okay, so the second part of the question is whether I've done this certainly I've not done this exact experiment where I've been getting my lipids at night and then picking them up in the morning in a cycle. I have, however, taken my lipids upon waking up in many other experiments before. And I can't say that I know for sure that they were always below 100, but I'm pretty confident they were always below 120 at least, because it certainly would have set off my alarms if I saw something that was like 140, 150. And that's why when I saw 220, I was like, what in the heck's going on? So anyway, go ahead and continue.
DPA_M asks, so you need at least 12 plus hours before blood tests for triglycerides to go down. But if you fast longer, say 16 to 18 hours, will it go up again? And just speaking from my own and others' experiments, as well as just the literature as it stands, the answer is yes, it will go up. Especially if you're fasting for like over a day, that's when I start to see, even 18 hours, I'll start to see it creeping up again. And that's probably just related to energy demands and hormonal changes while you're fasting for that long.
I agree. That's almost like a subject we could do like a whole video on. But the short, I guess you could say, look, the short version is if I'm trying to get the lowest triglycerides for being on a ketogenic diet, I feel pretty confident that it's going to be in that sweet spot between like 12 and 14 hours, maybe 12 to 16 hours, but I really doubt that I'd want to push it beyond 16 hours. And definitely I would want to do multi-day. If you're doing a full day or multiple days or something like that, I think there's a much higher chance that you're going to have higher triglycerides. And I mean, this is very commonplace data that we see over and over again here. And oftentimes we have people who write in and they said, well, I only fasted for 18 hours. It wasn't a full day. And then, we say, you may want to consider retesting. And then they retest and they come back like, oh, actually my triglycerides are super low now. It's great. Triglycerides are noisy. They're a very noisy marker. And obviously this just even further illustrates with just how much has changed over a day that I had after taking it, hour after hour. We already knew that with having eaten a meal. When you're eating a meal, your triglycerides are going to go way up if you're on a low carb, high fat diet. Just know that. Know that this is why you want to fast anyway, because if you eat just before you do your blood test, it's going to be higher because you literally installed those triglycerides into your bloodstream to fuel your tissues.
Right. And that's why I usually try to specify 12 to 14. Because sometimes people can get the I should be fasting to mean multiple day, or if I say you shouldn't be multiple day, they'll take it to mean no fasting. 12 to 14 seems to be the spot where it's most consistent.
Yep, I agree. It seems to be just the best window.
Action Camera asks, but what about the relation with HDL? So he essentially said that your triglyceride to HDL ratio doesn't seem very good with the higher triglycerides. And if triglycerides are going up when you're sleeping, does that leave you at higher risk of heart disease or a heart attack when you're sleeping because of that? So if your triglycerides are 200 and HDL is 100, then isn't that kind of bad?
I am very skeptical of that, actually, for something I just now said. Look, if you're on a low carb, high fat diet, I believe if you were to track the bumps of, when you're at high triglycerides through the day, you're going to have more area under the curve. You're going to have more total time that you're at higher levels of triglycerides if you were to take a blood test right then, because you are in fact powered by fat. And much of that is coming into the system in chylomicrons, right? And the chylomicrons being those lipoproteins that come from your gut. So the short answer is no, I'm not that worried about transient higher triglycerides because it's a necessity to some extent in providing the fuel. Now, with that said, do I know that this effect, this phenomenon that I'm now tracking, if you found that on the carnivore diet, your triglycerides stayed higher and for a longer period of time, that's deleterious? Can't say that I know. I'm probably skeptical if after 12 hours, it's under 100 triglycerides, under 100 milligrams per deciliter. But again, can't say that I can be certain just yet.
Right. And the other thing is, I think with triglycerides, it kind of depends. Is it transient, for example? Because if someone had triglycerides of 200 and HDL of 100, I would really, really want to know first what their other markers look like, because that could be someone who didn't properly fast, for example, or fasted longer than usual, or is not actually metabolically healthy, but they habitually drink alcohol and that drove their HDL up higher than it normally would be.
Right.
So it depends on the context, but it's definitely something I would want to look more into in a properly fasted state.
And see, now, truly, more than ever, I think past this point, this has really changed my perspective quite a lot, in that I don't even want people to ballpark whether they hit 12 hours fasted or not. I think if there's any question at all, I'm going to be pointing to this data and saying, look, you've seen the scatter plot. Going to the other side of the scatter plot, under 12, I mean, the standard deviation was all over the place. So if somebody's like, yeah, I think it was 12 hours, it might have been more like 9 hours or something like that. I'm gonna be like, we have to start with good data. You have to start there, because it's hard to figure out what the root cause is if we already know that the measurement is broken. The measurement itself is broken in under 12 hours. If, and I really want to caveat this again, if this gets replicated by other people. Again, it may be context specific to me. Of course, this is an N of 1. But this is the most compelling data I've seen for me personally, that I definitely care about getting my tests at around 12 hours or later, for that matter.
Yeah, and luckily there's actually a very easy way to make it so you don't need to use your memory. Just take a picture when you have your meal, take a picture when you finish the meal, and then take a picture of your arm after you get the blood drawn, because although they do put the time of the blood draw, sometimes it's delayed by a little bit depending on when they fill everything out. But that way you can just look at the timestamp on the pictures and be like, oh, this was literally exactly 12 hours.
Right. And certainly we're fans of taking pictures of our,
yeah.
of our data.
So Michael asks, I had no idea that triglycerides were so high after meals. I've had low triglycerides for a while, but now it appears that outside of fasting for 12 or more hours, they can be pretty high. What does this info mean for people who might not have as high HDL as we would like? My ratio is pretty good on my fasting lipid tests, but is that misleading?
And we effectively kind of answered this. I'm not as concerned about that.
Okay. And Livin Cincy asks, it seems you have a triglyceride rise at your dawn awakening similar to what a type 2 diabetic has. So essentially we answered this as well. It doesn't appear to be similar, but and then Dan asks, Dave, what meter do you use and or recommend?
So full disclosure, PTS Diagnostics, which makes the cardio check, they have provided service and product in the KetoFest cholesterol experiment, which took place last year when we were at KetoFest. And I want to acknowledge their goodwill for that. But obviously, I want to also say, full disclosure, that was something which they provided something for us. We've never taken any money from any affiliate or anything like that. So it's not like, they're paying us under the table. I more just want to be very upfront about that. My experience thus far with CardioCheck has been generally pretty positive. But that said, I kind of think of it like a glucometer. It's probably going to have like a 10 to 15% error rate, which is still way more than I'm comfortable with. But I haven't done a real solid breakdown of the data yet. And that's really forthcoming. I believe I found last time I checked that once I averaged it across everything, it ended up being about 9% pulling up, but that it still did have a decent standard deviation. In other words, it could still be a bit off from the labs. I hope to have a post soon where I actually go ahead and break down all the data that I have, because in virtually every time I've done a lab draw, I've done a cardio check lipid test right afterwards. So I'll have a good set of matching pairs to look at in that regard. So go ahead.
Yes. So that actually relates to another question we have. And it was asking if the amount of blood you get from the pipette and things like that, if that could impact the results and cause a wider error spread, essentially. Do you think that's possible, that user error is more likely with the cardio check?
I think that's a very fair question to ask, and I've usually asked it of myself with regard to lab draws. The tubes I don't have with me, but they are 40. What's the measurement under milliliters? I'll have to look, but it's basically, once I figured out what the total amount of blood is that's taken per capillary tube, I don't think it's really quite that significant, especially in taking it each hour. I'm more concerned about when I do these blood draws where they take like 9 or 10 tubes, because I don't think I could. I'm worried about wanting to do an experiment where I would want to do those like each day, because I think that is a significant amount of blood, and I would be worried about it being a confounder. But as far as the cardio check itself, I actually don't. I think I could take 20 in a day, and I doubt it'll confound the data, is my opinion.
Yeah. DT asks, why are high triglycerides bad for you anyway?
Well, of course, you'll find plenty of studies that high fasting triglycerides especially, and now there's a lot that are newer that are non-fasting, which I'm not a big fan of. But generally speaking, the more that triglycerides remain high in your bloodstream, the more that they're associated, especially with cardiovascular disease. And it's my personal opinion, just the theory that I'm working off of effectively, is that what we're really looking at is metabolic dysregulation of energy itself. And that's why oftentimes you see high fasting triglycerides coupled with high fasting glucose, is you've typically hit a place in which you've maxed out your personal fat threshold, and now it's having trouble parking it. And that's why another thing that high fasting triglycerides, or just high triglycerides in general, are associated with is the accumulation of fat that's not in your body fat, your adipose tissue, but actually in places that aren't designed to store fat. And this is known as ectopic fat. So fat stored in your liver, fat stored in your pancreas, even fat stored in your muscles and in your heart and so forth. Like there's places, basically at the point where you see accumulation of fat in places it shouldn't be, that's when you're in big trouble. And it's often accumulated with, or it's often coupled with very high levels of triglycerides in the blood.
So in other words, it could be a sign that something else that's not so good is going on. But again, it does somewhat depend on context. There are other contexts that are essentially completely unrelated to diet. For example, when I've gotten tests done when I was sick, my triglycerides were higher. It's in the literature that this is part of the immune response. But if you have an immune response that's kind of chronically going off, I would really wonder why. And then the last question is, do you think this could be related to cortisol levels in the morning or in the evening or what have you? And that was asked by several people.
Okay. Actually, as I'm answering this one, go ahead and check in on the chat. We'll see if we can take a few questions from the live chat. So cortisol, certainly cortisol is something that I wouldn't say it is typically in my wheelhouse. It's obviously very relevant, though, to inducing a higher breakdown of fat. And I even had some interesting discussions on Twitter about this recently. I don't think that I'm going to see a pronounced difference in cortisol, but the neat thing is that I do have labs coming back. Again, I took labs to bookend the first 14 days. Actually, the funny story is it's really the first 16 days because they failed to get blood for me at the 14-day mark. So for 16 days, I believe that I also included cortisol, so I'll actually be able to see what the cortisol levels are, and I'm quite curious. Incidentally, I'm also getting some other hormones that people rarely don't get, such as leptin, insulin, of course, I feel like everybody should be getting all the time, but also some other ones that almost nobody gets, like adiponectin. I'm kind of excited to see what that's going to look like. So do we have any questions there in the live chat?
Yes. So Joey asked, why does coffee, even without butter or heavy whipping cream, cause a rise in triglycerides?
So this is kind of a pet subject of ours. We've been sent some studies, and there certainly are things that suggest that there's a greater lipolysis induced. I believe some of the studies focused on coffee, but a lot of them also focused on caffeine in particular. And it's hard to disentangle those two because usually you don't get that high level caffeine unless you're having coffee. So how much of it is coffee, how much of it isn't, I don't know. I do know that coffee has other properties to it. It's like an adenosine aggravator, for example. And all of these things may play a role, but until we can actually have more people that do experiments that are like, extreme decaf drinkers, which there really aren't many, or people who have some other source of caffeine that's extremely high, which is just unlikely if it's not coffee. They either have to just be like a chronic drinker or something that has enough caffeination that is comparable to somebody who's a coffee drinker, or something else. But this actually gets me back to this new kind of theory you and I were chatting about from a little bit earlier, which is the very first case in which I saw somebody go carnivore and they saw their triglycerides go up dramatically was actually Brenda Zorn. She had gone and just eaten pretty much steaks for 30 days. And the one key exception was that she was also going to have coffee at the same time. Mm-hmm. And her triglycerides exploded up to 500, if my memory is correct.
Yep.
Which was stunning. Like you're only having 2 ingredients. And I wondered if it could have been, at the time, I wondered if it could have been a micronutrient deficiency, maybe something that she became deficient in that period of time. But now I'm wondering more about this in that it seems to come up more. It seems the unexpectedly high levels of triglycerides come up more with people on a carnivore diet. Mm-hmm. And often the first place we jump to is coffee, because coffee's been we've already had so many cases where people have said, I'm having unusually high triglycerides. We asked them about the coffee part. It turns out that they do drink coffee. And I seriously want to, tell me if this is hyperbole. I want to say it's around a 75% success rate. Of those people who mention that they drink coffee and have unexpectedly high triglycerides, we go, you may have a coffee sensitivity. Try not having coffee for 10 days and maybe retest. And I think of those people that have done it, it's around that, like a 75% success rate. Am I right about that? Did I lose you?
Bring that up with, I would say that's about right.
Okay, Siobhan, I think your connection might be petering out a little bit, or at least with me, it hasn't quite come through exactly. Anyway, that seems to be the pattern that I've observed the most, to where it's made us think that it's coffee. But it was always interesting that it seemed to be with carnivores a little more proportionately than just keto in general. And so this is why I'm starting to wonder if there really is possibly a connection between not just having very low insulin levels, but maybe having coffee on top of that. Obviously, in my case, I'm specifically just having the meat and water. I'm not having anything with any caffeination. But even with not having anything with caffeination, I still see these dramatically higher levels of triglycerides. I'm wondering if, and I really can't stand coffee, but if I were able to drink coffee, if I would actually see that there was a more prolonged period of time in which my triglycerides were higher. So I don't know, that's the new theory I'm hatching. I'm kind of interested to find out if that might be the case. Right. Siobhan, I see your icon moving a little bit, so I think you may not be as frozen now.
Hopefully I'm fixed. If not, oh well.
Great. Were there any other questions from the chat? We should probably wrap up here pretty soon.
I didn't see any, but if they do have questions, they can always go to the question post on cholesterolcode.com, and we could probably follow up there. Rad did say he found a study about protein and gastric emptying. He wasn't sure if he could post the link. He should be able to, but he can also go over to cholesterolcode.com and leave the link in a comment, and we can see it.
Yeah, well, just real quick for everybody watching right now, we're actually going to set up a post for this that's going to include the video from yesterday and this video. And in that post, feel free to comment as well and ask any questions. This is pretty exciting new data. I'm hopeful that some other people find interesting enough that they could do some additional replication. But even for the data being N of 1 for right now, I think this is pretty compelling stuff, just particularly given how much I've replicated it over and over again myself. And I'll be very interested to see what happens when I go back out of carnivore. And my fingers are just going to have to suffer. I'm going to have to just take a lot of these cardio checks, a lot of those capillary tubes. It's just going to have to be what it is, because the data is just too powerful. This may be kind of a game changer for me, especially. So we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Siobhan, I hope you're going to have a good weekend.
Yeah, you too, Dave. And again, if anybody has questions, anything, post up.
All right. We'll talk to you guys later. Happy New Year.